Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are 1 minute early, which, given that I'm Italian, this has got to be some sort of a world record. So let me welcome you to this afternoon session. This meeting has been extraordinarily inspiring and insightful. I trust you all agree. And the session you are about to see, I think will continue because it is on a topic of extraordinary interest, which is the mismatch between the technology platforms that are available through digital health and their use in clinical trials. But before we get to that, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Mauro Ferrari. It's a great honor to be here with all of you. I actually hail from Texas, as you might have guessed from my accent. And if not from that, from the cowboy boots that I'm sporting, which now I'm becoming less self-conscious about wearing ever since Jim Ellison made it cool to be a scientist from Texas. Thank you very much. Now, what I do for a living in Texas, as you might know, in Houston, we have the nation's largest medical center, so-called the Texas Medical Center. And within that, one of the founding hospitals is the Houston Methodist Hospital. So I happen to run research at the Houston Methodist Hospital, all academics, and I'm executive vice president of the hospital system. I'm a scientist by heart. Don't tell anybody, but the rest I'm kind of faking. I've been faking it for a while. Fake it until you make it. You know how that works. But that's what I do. I'm a scientist, and I will try to throw in a little bit of science in some of my comments towards the end. I had the privilege of working at the National Cancer Institute for a while. I was a professor at Berkeley. I did a number of different things. I come to the medical world through a background that was in math and engineering type of things. I went to med school in my 40s, imagine that. I can write situation comedies about that all day long. So, now we are talking about digital health, the digital health platforms. And as you all have seen many times, I'm sure, in your lives and careers, especially in healthcare, the way innovation comes into existence many times, right? There is a cluster of technology triggers. In this knowledge-based economy, you get some technology triggers, some discoveries, and then everybody gets excited and starts moving in a certain direction. And then you get this quick in the curve of growth. You have this quick rise to the peaks of inflated expectations, very high peak of inflated expectations. And then after a period of time, there is some disappointment, and you start precipitating down towards the unfair level trough of disillusionment, right? But fortunately, then people start identifying some low-hanging fruits and start moving towards that, and then you start to go back up, and the slope of enlightenment, as it has been called, until you reach some pragmatic plateau of practicality or plateau of productivity, where you actually are able finally to meet some real needs of the society that we are serving with some stability built into the operations. Now, that curve that I just described, I think we have seen in so many different areas. I don't need to remind you of them. So the topic of this panel is really, where are we on that curve for what pertains to digital health and its application to clinical trials, which is, of course, is a fundamental bottleneck in bringing innovation discovery to the service of the patients. Now, there is no, of course, exact science about at what level should that peak should that plateau of productivity reside, or how long we should be staying in the various in-between phases after the inflated expectations and hopefully moving past of course, the trough of disillusionment. That is what we're here to talk about. But what I'm hoping is that we never forget that everything that we do always has to be with our primary focus on patients. We are in a service profession, right? Our profession is to serve those that are diseased, those that suffer. we have the ethical responsibility to be of the greatest possible service to them that is intrinsic in what we do. And it is because of that that we have structured the panel today to comprise great experts from that I will introduce in a moment, from the technology platform, the digital health side. Of course, from the perspective of those that would apply that in the pharmaceutical world. We have expertise on the CRO side, everything that leads to the ability to formulate drugs and devices so that they can then be taken into clinical trials, and everything is capped by the patient perspective. And I will introduce the speakers in a moment. Before I do that, so what are we talking about when we talk about digital platforms as they pertain to clinical trials or to health more in general? Well, of course, we know some of the fundamental keywords that we've all been using is deep learning, is artificial intelligence, is sightless trials, is you can even go into the specifics of the technologies that associate with these practices, the notion of having wearable sensors that allow us to monitor patient response during clinical trial, or sometimes, as we've heard at the beginning of the day today, you can even dream up of novel therapeutics that are really foundationally digital in nature. You heard this brilliant presentation this morning about digital therapeutics. That's a transformational concept, right? That's a transformational concept. Not the only one, perhaps, that crosses that boundary between the pharmaceutical sciences and medicine and other disciplines that are inspired by mathematics. I will make reference to another one in a second. So these are the things that we have, the tool set that we have at our service to be able to engender transformational benefits for society. On the other hand, what are the difficulties? You will hear about them from our distinguished panelists, but broadly speaking, they follow in a number of different classes. And one of those, starting from the most important thing, is patient participation. We are here to serve patients, including making it as easy as possible for the patient population to participate in the trials for their own benefits and for the benefits of society. So I will cite one little story about that. You know, my wife is right here, Paula. My wife and I, she runs the important thing, a program in a very impoverished part of the world, and we become friends with the local population. And after years and years of showing up there, one day, on the first day on the spot, this lady that is our next door neighbor, very, very poor lady, I don't know how old she is, I cannot guess. She comes up and we talk and we have little dinner at our home. And I ask her, so how are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm doing okay, but not really. I got diabetes. I said, oh, you got diabetes. There are many things that we can do for you if you get diabetes. And she shows me later in the dinner, after a couple of drinks, she shows me this great new piece of technology that you've seen a million times that allows her to read her glycemia from a finger prick. I said, look what you got. You know, right here in the middle of nowhere in a very impoverished area of the world, but look at this great technology you got in hand. And she said, oh, yeah. She wasn't as satisfied as I thought that she would be from the compliment. So a couple of more glasses of wine, and then she says, so I told her, come on, I can tell that you're not happy. What's wrong with you? She says, you know, I do this, and it works, and it gives me numbers. I says, what it's supposed to do? It gives you numbers. Yeah, she says, but it gives me numbers. What's your problem? She says, look, I can't read numbers. This may sound stunning, but I can assure you, and you all know it, that she is much more representative of the world population than you and I are. So what do you do next? And then you spend a bunch of time teaching her to read numbers, and you learn why she didn't know numbers, because she wasn't the smartest in the class. They had a little school, but you know, she wasn't the smartest in the class, and so the teacher used her to babysit her own kids while she was teaching the others. You know, that's just one story, just to keep the perspective in mind of what we are here to do. Second classes of difficulties, so how do you involve people? Globalization's got challenges, and this is all about the service that we're trying to provide. Second, culture of course, of the adoption of new technologies. No, at my hospital, no, I got about 7,000 doctors, and and some of them really love technologies. Not all of them really love technology. I think I still see some Blackberries around, and not as paperweights. So, sometimes it is not as difficult. Sometimes challenges that come with technologies have to do with the interfaces between technologies, what we call interoperability. We just went through, I don't want to tell you how many hundreds of millions of dollars to do a big switch to one of the major systems. I'm not going to advertise for them. So, those are difficulties that, of course, come back in spades, especially when you're doing advanced applications such as in clinical trials. Cultural and technology barriers, cybersecurity problems. We get millions of attacks per day on our hospital system. If one of them makes it through, the hospital suffers tremendous damage, and most importantly, of course, the patients suffer tremendous damage. Regulatory compliance, we have been hearing some about that, and of course we are happy that we got pre-cert to 1.0 with the Digital Health Innovation Plan announced a couple of months ago that we just heard about. So there are steps that have been taken in the right direction, and costs is the ultimate challenge in many ways, because paraphrasing the bumper sticker, savings that come through healthcare, of course, deployment of new technologies, savings may be global, but the costs are very local, and right here, right now, and they are yours. So that's the way it works. So these are some of the boundary conditions that we're going to be looking at through this exceptional panel of experts that we have, and I will proceed to introduce them right now. We are going to be starting out with Steve Rosenberg, who currently serves as Senior Vice President and General Manager of Oracle Health Sciences. He is a legend in his field. Here he is. Here we go. Thank you. He is the one that introduced cloud-based solutions, including integrated approach to clinical trial management, new methodologies for patient-reported outcomes, introduction of advanced analytics, and at-risk healthcare payers and providers. He was the force behind Phase Forward. You may remember a few years back, and Phase Forward, of course, was a transformational success, #1 clinical R&D solution in the world in 2009, when it went public, as I recall. So with a great record of successes and expertise, Steve is going to be starting us out. Second is Paula Brown Stafford. And Paula, in my mind, is the person that I associate the most if I'm looking at the establishment of the CRO industry through her leadership at Quintile, but of the whole industry more in general. So, of course, very much looking forward to hearing from you right now. She's an adjunct professor in public health leadership program at the University of North Carolina, but she's also a board member of Novan, and a board member of CRO Health Decisions, and a number of other initiatives. Our third speaker, Gerald Nehm, is Vice President of Global Development for Medical Devices and eHealth at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. So we get the pharmaceutical perspective. But this gentleman is pretty unbelievable if you look at what is done in the past, not only the pharma leadership, but he was at the FDA before that. He was in professional practice as an MD before that, in private practice first, but then also at Duke University. So you can bring multiple perspectives. Last by, I'm not going to say last but not least, last by decision and by specific architecture is Mr. Marc Boutin. And Marc represents the voice of the patients. So I asked him if he would mind being the last to speak so that he can provide an echo and a responsorial to the other presentations, and for added emphasis. He is currently the CEO of the National Health Council. He has been a leading voice for greater patient involvement at every stage of healthcare, the healthcare continuum. Has been on the board of PCORI, and a number of other things. And so I think I will ask you to be our conscience, or at least our conduit to our own consciences. How's that? So I appreciate that very much. And the last provocation in terms of science, we have seen one example of drugs that nobody would have dreamt of defining as a drug piece of software now being on the front-end software and on the back-end biotech. You saw that in the presentation earlier today. And I would venture to say that, of course, to get the greatest possible benefit from the digitalization of the world, we also need to rethink the way we approach biology in health and in disease. One big word that has been missing all day long is physics. It's physics, it's mathematics. They come together, they help us move from a descriptive, no matter how sophisticated a descriptive definition of biology, into a place where you can quantitate. And with quantitation, definition of diseases change, and the way practices or the introduction of new therapeutic devices will change at the same time. I'm talking of fields such as transport oncophysics, where the quantifiable marker that you follow throughout the development and throughout deployment of the drug is drug concentration. It's a number, it's something that you can look at. It's not a set of discrete targets as we do in biology, no matter how sophisticated that would be. Not to supplant, but to supplement. And with this provocation, I am delighted to invite Steve. The floor is yours.
Should I get up or just do it for me?
Do.
Oh my God.
If you got slides.
I don't have slides, but I'll stand up.
All right. Stretch your legs. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I really wish I had an Italian accent right now. I can't even tell you how boring I sound. I grew up nearby here, so forget about it, I guess. But I don't know. I don't know. But you know, I was sitting there going, I feel like I'm in the North End, you know, being told the specials, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich with this. Never mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about the technology. And the supposition of my whole talk, which is 7 minutes, is, I was told it was 7 minutes, is that technology is not the barrier to this. So, you know, the technology to do clinical trials with devices and other digital forms of data is in place. The barriers, I could talk forever about the barriers, but this esteemed panel is going to talk about that forever. So you got to think about, like, how many people here are wearing a watch that's going to remind them to stand up every hour? All right, I had one that I got rid of that was reminding me to breathe. I thought I had that nailed. Well, maybe I didn't at that point. But there is everything in place. So if you think of the technology required to do this, you need devices, and there are a gajillion devices out there now. And there's devices that you wear on your wrist. There's devices that you have, like blood pressure cuffs. There are devices that you put on your finger. There are devices that you put in your clothing. There are devices that you put around your head, which is pretty amazing. So I picture the poor patient that's got the headband, the clothing, walking around holding 8 devices, and now we've made clinical trials easier for him. So, but that's a whole other thing. Then other than devices, you need a way to collect that data and put it somewhere where it's important. And the amount of data that these devices collect is enormous. So there's technology. You know, I'm trying not to make this an Oracle commercial, but we're one of the major providers with Google and SAP and other major providers that have infrastructure that takes messages from a device, they get transported into the famous cloud, and they find their place to the right place, securely, unhackable, good to go. They go either to somebody's cloud to our cloud or something like that. And then what you need when the data gets there is all the buzzwords. So I love the technology buzzwords. You know, there's ones that are specific, but I usually put up a slide when I'm talking to customers that we're completely buzzword compliant. So I use words like big data analytics, machine learning, blockchain. I love blockchain. That's the one that may throw me out of this industry completely, blockchain. After 40 years, it's like, really? But blockchain has big uses, by the way, but let's not get carried away. Artificial intelligence, it's another good one. Is that oxymoronic? And cloud computing. So all these things do exist, though, and all these things actually have a place in what we're talking about mHealth. The ability to wear a device that makes sense, to collect that data, have it transported either through a phone or directly to a cloud or some cellular network into a place, have it delivered to the right platform for people to analyze that data and validate that data, that exists. And so the barriers are something completely different. There's been a lot of promises on what this stuff can do. So that's why the technology vendors like us, we've built all this stuff. We've invested an enormous amount of money to build the infrastructure to allow the industry to adopt this. if I think about my career, which has been across all kinds of software, I've rarely built software on spec. Right? So every time you put a new system out, there are people that are going to use it almost right away. Right? You build something and you sell it. It's an unmet need in the world of software, or it's replacing something old, replacing a process that existed that wasn't done well. In this particular case, we kind of built it all on spec. It's like, here's all this infrastructure. Go forth and use it at your pace. And it's kind of a very different way of thinking about the investment that we and other software companies make in this. We're not dictating how you should conduct a clinical trial with this. We are just making it available as the industry needs it and goes forward. And I believe there's great value when used in the right places, and we'll hear about that later. There's huge promise, right? You know, what does it help? Safety, right? You can track, you know, are you going to get an epileptic fix soon? You could track movement. There's certain things that you could track with that. Different endpoints, mobility, you know, and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, these devices are making things. Adherence, which has a two-edged sword. If you have a device that does adherence and you get the drug approved, do you need the device to go with the drug? That kind of thing. And then patient retention. You know, maybe they stay enrolled, maybe you get indication. So I think my 7 minutes is up, so I'm going to turn it back over. Are you going to now introduce, or am I just going to run down the line? I'm going to introduce Paula. So, you know, he did a really lousy introduction to Paula.
Don't clap your hands for him when he's done.
Yeah, don't clap my hands. Other than the accent, Paula's way larger than what he described. Paula's actually defined this industry. She's probably been involved in more drugs that have been approved in the industry than any one individual. Is that a true statement? Can I make that up?
You made it up.
I made it up. But she's done a lot. I've known her for 15 years, so I'll give it to Paula. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to thank Mauro for the wonderful introduction. Now I have to thank Steve, and I want to thank Sue for the kind invitation to be here. Yes, I did spend 30 years with Quintiles, sort of the preeminent CRO, now part of IQVIA. I retired at the end of 2015, and now I'm on the pharma side, as well as being an adjunct at UNC, teaching public health leadership. With all that said, I've seen a lot in my years, and I was recalling, just even sitting here, that my first conversation with an executive at the time, you know, all these company names changed. 1991, I was in Palo Alto, California, starting up Quintiles California operation, and I was meeting, I think his name was Dr. Tim Spiro, and he was with Roche, and or Genentech, Roche, Genentech, you know, one of those. But anyway, he was there, and he drew for me the first time what we're still talking about. And he drew the triangle, and he said, you're a CRO, and I want you to tell me how I'm going to decrease the time. I want you to tell me how I'm going to decrease the cost, and I want you to tell me how I'm going to improve quality. In 2014, so just 4 years ago, I testified before Congress on the 21st Century Cures Act, and that testimony was around modernizing clinical trials. And as I sat on the panel, the only CRO represented, what we ended up talking about was time, cost, and quality. And I'm with Steve that I have known him for 15 years because he's the one who convinced me to finally use Phase Forward for EDC. But when I look back on, again, the years, you know, first it was fax data collection in the late 80s. And then in the 90s, we went to electronic patient-reported outcomes. You know, we had the IVRS tools. I think they're now IRX or whatever you want to call them. Then it was the early 2000s, we went to EDC, or electronic data capture. And we're still, as an industry, somewhat trying to adopt and move that forward, but I think everybody's pretty much there. You know, but now, we're in the 2000s and we're talking about wearables. But there, you know, the technology has changed, but the problem is still the same. And let me just go to the next. You know, I think will I be able to go front and back? Because I'd like to switch around. Can I go? Yeah, okay. So I do think there's sort of three things that we need to think about in this world of utilizing the technology better to help us to decrease the cost, to decrease the time and to improve the quality. And it really comes, and this is really simple. You got the patient, you heard about the physician, and we have globalization. So I'd like to touch on all three of them rather briefly in my sort of 5 minutes left. In my career, I think I've touched, millions of patients now. I've touched thousands, probably hundreds, thousands of physicians. And I've run clinical research in over 100 countries. And again, it's the patients, it's the physicians, it's the globalization. It's those very things that to some degree are keeping us from advancing the technology. And I don't want to steal all of Mark's thunder because we didn't share comments, on the patient. So I'll just say, as an example, my father in 1998 was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. And before I say this, I want to say, how many people here have been in a clinical trial? How many people have had a family member, including yourself, so keep your hand up, in a clinical trial? Right? But it's still not even quite half the room, and we're in healthcare, we're in life sciences. And my own father ended up in a clinical trial. And sort of there's a good and a bad. We had 3 years with him that I think we wouldn't have had if he hadn't been in this. But only because I'm in the business, my mother would have never known that the product that my father was on was approved. And that and I get chills saying it, because he had an impact. And for her to know that is huge. But how many people really know after they've participated in a clinical trial, was it ever approved? Because the name changes from what they saw in their protocol to what it's when it goes out there. We're in healthcare, you probably know, but I suspect, I haven't done the poll, but the average person does not know if they're in a clinical trial, how that ended. So I think there's a lot as an industry that we need to continue to do in terms of building awareness around the benefits of clinical trial, not only to the individual, but to society, to medicine, to their future relatives, and looking forward. So I think that there's a lot that we can do in terms of awareness. I also think that we have to drive patients to clinical research. And so when I talk about physicians, I'll talk a little bit about what we can do to increase the number of physicians doing clinical research. But we have to use, whether it's AI, ML, big data analytics, but using data to match patients to sites. I know Mal's here from IQVIA, and you're doing a lot in this regard. But how much are we using it day to day? We're still talking about a lot more of it than we're actually utilizing it. And then I think we need to support the technology to ensure patient adherence. I think once patients get in trials, to have the value of the patient in that trial, we need to continue what we can do in the industry to add to compliance of patients, making sure that they and the physician are following the protocol and they're actually taking the meds, and changing diaries from the old-fashioned, we all talk about it, filling it out in the parking lot before they'd go see the doctor, 10 days worth of a diary. I think we've moved past that now. But still, I think even the ePro and even EDC, I'm struggling right now on a trial to get all the data in. I'm like, it's EDC, it should have been entered. The patient's finished when? I can't say that because I'm a public company, but they finished on this certain date, and you're still waiting for data to be entered even in the EDC because it's in an EHR, but that doesn't mean it's in the electronic data capture. So we have a lot of hurdles to overcome there. Oh, I did stay on the globe, didn't I? Sorry about that. All right, so we're going to go to the physician now. There still is a single digit, and I keep trying to get the latest number, and I don't know if anybody has it, but it's really a single digit in terms of percentage of physicians that are actually doing clinical research. And at least we haven't changed that number, because in every bit of research I tried to do to find out, that number has got to be higher now, with as much as oncology work is going on and people in clinical trials. But all that you can find is it's less than 10% of physicians. So I think that we have to solve that problem and drive the right patients, so as we match patients to physicians, but we need more clinical researchers out there. And to do that, I think there's a couple of things. We have to recruit. Again, are we doing enough to share the benefits, increase the awareness and the interest? Again, a little story. For me personally, I live next door to a physician. He had never done any clinical research. He was in a general family practice. And I thought, okay, we're doing a late phase 4, big study. I won't go into the indication. And I was talking to him. He said, oh, yeah, I'd love to get into that. I'd love to get into research. So I set him up. We put him in the study, and he couldn't get out of that study fast enough. He was one and done. And really because not only is the technology hard, but the regulatory aspects are hard, the quality, the retention of the patients, the finding the patients, the advertising, all the things that they don't have in their practices today and that we're asking them to do. We need to make it easier, and we need to train physicians to be clinical researchers. And then we have to retain them so that they're not one and done. So as an industry, we have to work with these. How am I doing? Oh, I'm going long, aren't I? Okay, all right, so went the wrong way. And I guess finally, globalization is just adjusting and embracing globalization. It's been tough, I know, in terms of technology for capturing data from an EHR. Sweden has their own system, but the US has how many different EHR systems? And so to take data and bring all of that into a clinical trial, unfortunately, we're still doing a lot of copying and pasting of data, et cetera. So we need data standards, and I'll end on it, technology standards and standard of care, so healthcare practice and standardization of that. So I think these are the barriers that come to mind for me in my years of experience. So I will hand it over to Jerry.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Gerard Nehm. I'm from Bayer Healthcare Pharmaceuticals. And I want to thank the meeting organizers for having me here and the panelists, and thank you, Dr. Ferrari, for the nice introduction. So I'm going to, yeah, I can get up to the top there. No. Let's get all of it. Yeah, I'm basically having 3 slides here. Okay. And, all right. This looks like a very busy slide, and I just want you to read it in the background. I'm going to try and talk about what's holding back the technology from advancing clinical trials. And we've heard a lot about how it's not just a technological barrier anymore. Many of those things have been supplanted, and those have been taken care of. So we have, communication systems, worldwide networks. We have the ability to store information in the cloud. We have advanced analytics. We have paradigms that we've never had before to be able to analyze data in ways that we couldn't just 10 or 15 years ago. So all of that's in place. So what is the big problem here? Because there are some problems in doing this to scale. If you look at the first point on this slide, it's that there's a big mismatch between what's going on in the medical device development world and what happens in clinical development. Whereas medical devices and software development typically have a cycle time of somewhere between 6 and 18 months. If you look at drug and biologic development programs, because they're disease-specific, you need to enroll patients, you need to be able to wait for clinical outcomes to occur, you're really looking at timeframes that can be 6 to 8 years once you get into late-stage development. That's very common. So if you look at that just on its face, you come to the conclusion that the cycle time for medical devices, monitoring devices, and things like that is much more rapid. So during the course of a clinical trial, you may have several generations of products that will come to market and be better than the last. The question then becomes, how do you bridge between product A and product B and product C, especially in monitoring devices, if you're trying to put wearables or unwearables, as we like to call them, on patients? So drug development is typically conservative, it's phase-gated, it's very risk-averse in terms of its strategy. And if you look at medical device development, it has a different strategy, right? It's iterative, right? We have design controls, we have quality systems, but basically it's designed to operate at a very rapid engineering pace. So there's an intrinsic mismatch here that we can't ignore. If you then look at the regulatory landscape for what is going on here, It's evolving quickly. It's a little bit uncertain. And in many ways, there are analogies to what has happened before. And what I mean by that is many of the things that we would care to monitor about patients, that we can digitize, that we can transmit, that we can store, that we can analyze, these things really amount in the end to digital biomarkers of one sort or another. And people have been operating with wet biomarkers for a long period of time, and the qualification standards for what needs to be done in order to validate or to qualify a biomarker have changed over time. In fact, the FDA in 2014 published a guidance document that was a generic document about this, that they've since withdrawn because there was a meeting in 2016 after the 21st Century Cures Act that was an NIH consensus meeting about types of biomarkers. And there are 7 different categories of biomarkers, and the FDA now has decided, I think very smartly, that they need to revise that biomarker document. And this makes a lot of sense. But there is some regulatory uncertainty, and for those of you who saw the iWatch 4 back a month ago, in the de novo categorizations that were determined by FDA, there were some surprising things there, I think. And so we can see that the field's rapidly moving. Commissioner Gottlieb actually issued a letter on September 26th to try and explain their thinking about that. I think that he used some terms in that letter that were very interesting. General purpose sensors, for instance. I'm not aware that any such thing exists. But the FDA is trying right now to separate several different classes of device. Hardware from software, for one thing, and mechanical pieces from hardware, software associated with computing and data capture and storage. And lastly, there aren't that many synergies that really exist between device development on the one hand, and those engineering principles, and what we have to do in clinical development programs. I only have 3 slides, so don't worry. I want to go back to basics, because I know that not everybody in the audience is somebody who designs clinical trials. So if you're going to look for digital biomarkers on a per-study basis, you need to ask some very basic questions, like what markers are going to be monitored and why? Okay? What's the target population? All of them can be different. What's the source of the material? What are you looking at exactly? How often should you sample, and how often should you average things? This is very relevant in the digital world. How long will the monitoring continue? Is it days, weeks, months, years? How often do we transmit data and assess it? I mean, for safety issues and other things. What do we do with missing data? All of this is very relevant. What should be used as a benchmark? What's a normal range? When do you know when you're outside the normal range? And what is a minimally clinically important difference? How do you know when something's changed enough that anybody should care? These are all relevant issues that unfortunately don't have one-size-fits-all answers. And there are other questions that fall under these headings, but all of these need to be considered very carefully. Okay. Last slide. This one looks very busy, and it is. I just want you to focus on a couple of things. If you look at the study needs, when you design a clinical trial and you say, what do I need to measure and why? These are core issues for any development program. It's not new in the digital era. We always have to do this. But now we have more flexibility. There are many more things that we could measure. So then you might search for a device that could monitor these things in a clinical trial. And you go through this device search, and you identify them, you look for gap analyses, you look at predicates, platforms, et cetera. If there's an exact match, you go and adopt that device. And then you can plug it in perhaps to the platform that was described earlier to use it. But if there's no exact match, then what do you have to do? Then you have to go across, and you have to develop the device, or you have to adapt the device for your purposes. And this includes the hardware, the software, the analytics, the systems integration. So there is a systems engineering component here that's very, very important. And there's device qualification that comes after that. And it's design verification, validation, human factors, and usability studies. Critically important in order to be able to know whether your device is going to measure what you want it to in the patient population you're interested in. These are all design control elements. Then you can go and get a regulatory clearance, and that's fine. But what you haven't done yet is what's in the bottom line, and this is what holds things up. This is the clinical validation of the biomarker that you've identified. What does it mean? Okay, so again, going back to the biomarker type, What are the analytical paradigms that you're going to use? Are these time series analyses? Are these Bayesian types approaches to the analysis that you're going to do? Are they frequentist analyses? Are they other types of analyses against benchmarks? What are the normal ranges? And again, what's the minimally clinically important difference that regulators will buy into in order to be able to determine or support safety and efficacy? And then ultimately, as I described before, then you adopt it in the clinical trial, and there may be phase transitions to other like products, and you have to do bridging studies to be able to make sure that the data that you collect in the study is actually useful and compatible all the way through the study because of the time mismatch I alluded to before. And then there's the next phase. Okay, I think I've taken up most of my time. This is not really a technical issue anymore. People are developing sensors of various types, not just to measure heart rates and blood pressures, but also small molecules in sweat, metabolites, other sorts of things that are particularly relevant potentially to clinical trials. But you've got to go through this process and be able to prove that these have meaning, that they're of value, that they can support safety and efficacy, and that in and of itself is a development program. So a lot like developing PRO instruments, and we have guidance documents from FDA from 2009, many of the same elements apply. Good. I'll stop there and pass it on to our next colleague.
So my name is Marc Boutin, and I'm your conscience. You can call me Mark. It's okay. I want to thank you for the opportunity to have a patient perspective here, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself, the organization I represent, and give you a perspective on this topic. I'm going to need to hold on to my notes, though. I became a patient advocate about 25 years ago, and like many patient advocates, it happened completely by chance. I was living in Europe at the time, and over a 4-month period, everyone in my family was diagnosed with one or more chronic conditions, ranged from heart disease, cancer, neurologic, autoimmune, rare, and HIV. Ended up moving back to the United States, living in Boston, close to where I grew up in Maine, so I could help take care of my family. Over a period of 2 years, virtually all of them passed away. And they died for 2 reasons. First, there were no effective therapies or interventions for their condition. And second, because they couldn't get access to the interventions that existed. So I lost essentially my entire family over that short period of time. Been incredibly interested in driving innovation and driving meaningful and affordable access to high-value care. I've been in the patient advocacy community for about 25 years. I used to be a civil rights litigator. I'm now with the National Health Council, which is an umbrella organization that will be 100 years old in 2020. It was formed by the nation's leading patient advocacy organizations. And the CEOs of those groups, like American Heart, Cancer, Diabetes, as well as other conditions that are less prevalent, control the governance of the organization. But we have all stakeholders in membership: the life sciences companies, generics, device, the payer community, provider community, and family caregiving community. It's allowed us to take very nuanced, sophisticated policy positions on very complex issues. We do nothing that is disease or condition specific, but we work to drive access and innovation. We were able to insert more than 30 provisions into the Affordable Care Act. In User Fee 4, we inserted 1 provision. In User Fee 5, 5. In 6, we worked with the FDA on 6 provisions. It's a very powerful combination for the group. But I can remember I stood up in front of a group in 2006, very much like this. And as a patient advocate, we had become incredibly frustrated with what we were seeing in the innovation ecosystem. We were continually being told we were patients, and we, your surrogate, insert researcher, biopharmaceutical company, doctor, academic, regulator, we already know what you want and need. And I'll tell you, as a patient, that really incensed us. And this phenomenon was happening in Europe and in the US at the same time. And we stood up and said, no, you know what? You need to look at this different. You really need to understand the issues that are important to us. And again, we got, it's okay, we'll pat you on the head. We understand what's important to you. And so we said, you needed to engage us in the development of benefit-risk determinations. At the time, everybody was saying benefit-risk was a scientific determination, and that we would use science to figure it out. Well, the reality is there are scientific inputs, but benefit-risk is a judgment. And ethically, it has to represent the end user. And the only way it can represent the end user is to understand what is important to them. And while we focus on feel, function, and survival as the outcomes that matter, you have to understand the trade-offs, the weighting, the balance of those three core elements. We were behind the patient-focused drug development and partnered with the FDA, and they've done an amazing job. We have 4 guidances on their way out, which are going to give you incredible predictability on how to engage patients to determine what matters to them. But in one of the very early patient-focused drug development meeting on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, a disease that is 100% deadly, no effective treatments or interventions, that community had mapped out their disease to the point they had more than a dozen companies looking at potential treatments. But the outcome they were focused on was extending life by 6 months. And when you did qualitative and quantitative research with the families and then with the children with the disease, the boys, what they said is, I don't want to live 6 months. I'm on a ventilator. I can't move. I'm afraid I'm going to choke to death on my own saliva while I'm trying to sleep and not be able to call out for help. Don't give me 6 more months of that. What I want is the strength to grab my jacket with my teeth, throw my hand on the table, and type out a message to my friend on the iPad. 6 more months of that functionality, I'll take. 6 more months of survival, I don't want. What we've seen when we engage patients, the outcomes and the weighting of those outcomes that matter to them are different than what surrogates think. We're moving forward when it starts to focus on how we're developing these interventions. But where we are now is not quite the right place. We're really looking at data in silos. Clinical trial data is improving. It's beginning to focus on the outcomes that matter, not just patient-reported outcomes. And I really have to put a plug in for this. Most patient-reported outcomes are legacy. They were developed by surrogates, and they don't reflect the outcomes that matter to us. Patient-reported outcome is great, but only if it's an outcome that is relevant. If the most relevant outcome is reported by the physician, so be it. We're good with that. Focus in on the outcomes that matter. Real-world data is evolving. Most of the initiatives in the US and Europe have patients and patient advocacy organizations involved in really ensuring we gather the data that is most relevant to the end user. Still not quite there, but it's moving forward. And then we have tons of unstructured data. How many of you are registered to vote? So we have a pretty good civic audience. That's great. Did you know there are more than 100 companies in the United States with more than 5,000 data points on you? They know what shampoo you use. They know what you watch on TV. They know what you're downloading. They know if you have a gym membership, and they know if you actually use it. There's all kinds of unstructured data that could inform our thinking about health that is rarely being used. It leads us to a model that is population-based, focused in on the average person. Who in the room is the average person? We've got one. There's always at least one. Challenge with that is You want a treatment that responds to you clinically, but also the outcomes that matter to you. And in our current system in the United States, the focus is on utilization management to drive down costs, to force competition. And what that means is we have challenges with access. Huge challenges. But what I want to do now is what I did in 2006. I put out a bold vision for where we need to get to over the course of the next 7 years. And it was in 2006 on patient engagement in drug and device development. Everybody in the room laughed. But I said to the folks in the room, look to the person to your left. Go ahead. Look to the person to your right. Now, which one's more attractive? Now, hold that to yourself. What I said in 2006 is if you don't figure out this patient engagement thing, you will be out of business. I submit if you don't figure out how to deal with personalized care management in the next 7 years, you will be out of business. It's incredibly important. We're starting to see data being fused together. We're starting to embed behavioral and social science. That gives us an opportunity to segment populations, not just based on clinical outcomes. And remember, your genetics, about 20% of your health outcomes. The other 80% is behavioral and social. If we fuse behavioral and data science together, we can segment populations and identify the right population for whom should have the right intervention, not just what is clinically relevant. That is the future. And with this, it creates an entirely new business model for the life sciences companies and for the payer community. I mentioned we had payers in membership of the National Health Council. We currently have 3. At the end of the year, we will have 3 more, representing more than 80% of covered lives in the United States. And it's because they see value in this.
I love you, but you got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Well, that's more than I thought, because I'm almost done.
Okay, good. Sorry.
Want to wrap up by saying this is our opportunity to look to the future vision, to start to figure out how we move forward to get there. And what is exciting to me is the economics align across stakeholders. This isn't just the right thing to do. Economically, it makes sense for the payer. It's their opportunity to eliminate waste, to get better outcomes, and to drive their bottom line even on a calendar basis. And it gives you an opportunity to really focus in on high value, on what matters to patients, differentiate yourself in the marketplace, and use the data to get you there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's not forget, speaking about the advocacy community, that if you look at one transformational drug that has been cited several times today, Herceptin, beginning of an era, and the test that went with that, the beginning of molecular, of course, the companion diagnostics, that essentially came out of advocacy efforts, National Breast Cancer Coalition, in the early days of the first Clinton administration, essentially forcing the administration to create a breast cancer program that was assigned to the DoD to manage, still exists. Very transformational. That's the same people that are now bringing the physics-based drugs to the clinic as the next revolution. So thank you for your words, and thanks for everything the advocacy community does. We have a few minutes for questions. Sir.
So the idea of globalization, larger samples, more cost-efficient patient engagement, the idea of mobile devices being able to acquire data is useful, and maybe we're able to validate biomarkers, and maybe they can be used for therapeutic platforms also. But the idea of acquiring naturalistic data in a health system on a population basis on one end, and then the issue of conducting controlled research on the other. So I guess to Paula, one of the problems has been with CROs, with NIH-funded studies, they're one-offs. In other words, a mechanism is enacted to do a study on a specific question, and sites are recruited, trained, they conduct it, and disbanded. As some more forward-thinking or enlightened institutes have created enduring networks, CROs haven't necessarily done that. But it seems to me, and Rob Califf is probably the exemplar in terms of trying to blend the two. I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Thank you. Please, Paula.
Thank you, Jeff. I think globalization, it's a benefit, but it's also a hindrance because of the fact that data are collected, the data we collect, because the standard of care is different. And it's why I've said that we need to move towards more data standards. We have CDISC, which is helping on the clinical side, but you've got HL7 or others on the the medical side. But bridging those two together is a real challenge. I think that the technology is a challenge because of how we collect data in each country depends on the different systems that have been adopted in those countries. So I know I'm repeating myself a little bit. But the technology, and the more we can bridge the technologies together, and I'm sure Oracle is doing many things, and Steve can speak to this next, to bridge those together. But the standard of care, there are some countries that for some trials we wouldn't go into for certain therapeutic areas. I'm looking around the corner at Jeff. There's certain countries that we would just choose not to do a trial because the standard of care for that therapeutic area was just so different. And so harmonization of the standard of care is going to help it, be easy. I would say, quintiles and where we were founded and moved to globalization, we were just trying to globalize, to start the process and the people, and the systems are what have been coming next. You want to add anything, Steve?
No, that was fine.
Thank you. More questions?
Why not create standing or enduring networks of potential sites, whether they be embedded in healthcare systems or in some hybrid of academic institutions?
Yeah, Rob's been great at that, at DCRI, and he built a great network for cardiovascular. But then you had, DCRI competing with, the Timmy group up in Boston, and, you had different groups coming up with their own groups, and then you couldn't cross over the two because they each had their own standards. So you were held hostage to use one group and not be able to use the other, is just, in my experience. But I don't disagree that the networks are hugely helpful.
Jerry?
Yes. Just an additional comment. I think that when you have networks, they can be very valuable because they can streamline your ability to sort of, operationalize studies, recruit patients, et cetera. The difficulty is the question ultimately of have you cherry-picked and is the information you get generalizable? So if you're constantly using the same sites, if you're constantly using the same patients, then the question becomes, are you using something that's not terribly representative of everybody who will use a particular therapy or intervention later? It's not an easily answerable question. Sometimes they are very generalizable, and sometimes they're not. So I think it's it's something that needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I will say that there are other kinds of networks, and the FDA has bought into this. For instance, the iSpy and iSpy 2 study designs, where there are networks there that have a novel approach to recruiting patients and essentially allocating patients. That's not random. That's dependent upon where things have gotten to that point, what the point estimates are for matching the next patient into what's occurred before. And we all know that there's noise, okay? When you power a study, you do it because you expect a certain effect size, and you power it with a certain number of patients with a null hypothesis, trying to decide whether what you're trying to find out is or is not true. When at each step along the way, you're making an allocation based on potentially the noise that's occurred to date, thinking that you can then interpret that in the same kind of a framework, you really can't. People have written a lot about this. They've tried to correct for it. They've looked for confounders. They've looked at known unknowns and unknown unknowns and all sorts of other things. But it's kind of a little bit of a dangerous road to go down. So it's just, I'm not disagreeing with your point. I'm just saying you have to take it with a little bit of a caveat that these other things may become issues.
Yes, sir.
Just to be provocative.
We got another one?
What?
We got somebody here, if you can. Please. Why don't you introduce yourself as well, if you don't mind? Just a quick second then. Okay.
Hi, my name's Courtney Katz, and I work for Intracellular Therapies here in Alexandria. And my question is for Paula. I was just wondering, how do we really encourage, like, IQVIA staff? You talked about a physician and all the regulatory aspects and stuff to get them upstarted and involved in clinical trials. But then also, how do you encourage, like, the staff of IQVIA to really go out and, like, find the right PIs for a specific, the sponsor depends on certain things. And how do you, when you get the right PI, encourage them to really scale up education and outreach to find the right patients and have patients not feel like they're like guinea pigs in research, and how do you help facilitate that process so you can just get the right patients so they stay in the study and encourage them to feel like they're part of something bigger, because like their family members get involved and they're worried about them being in clinical trials and things like that. Thank you.
I'll say, one, I can't speak for IQVIA because I've never worked for IQVIA. I was with Quintiles, but what I'll say is that I think that we need to invest in communication, just continual communication with patients and with physicians. And in terms of training the physicians, there's a company, Eligo Research, which is trying something very different down in Texas, John Potoff, and he is looking at data, at analytics, and trying to drive pharma to research sites that have those kind of patients. And so they're doing it a little bit, backwards, which, I think is yet another thing we should certainly try, because I don't think there's any one answer, but I think there's a lot of investment in, as I mentioned, the identifying, using data to identify patients and sites, and then training investigators, training physicians to be clinical researchers, and there's investment, and there's, IQVIA and other companies who are providing resources to sites now that give them some different expertise than a physician site normally would have. And that is understanding the regulatory process and the documentation, et cetera. So it's training new types of resources within a investigative site.
We are unfortunately out of time, but given that you had the doctor, given that you had if you want to finish up,
This will be a little provocative. As somebody who does clinical trial research, I'd love to have technology that made the conduct of studies less burdensome, more efficient, produce results that are more generalizable. But the big question is whether collecting this passive data, whether it's physiologic or simply active or even subjectively input, is actually going to mean anything. And to the point that the chair made initially, the private sector has owned this up until now for the most part and has not engaged with the traditional biomedical sort of community to really rigorously validate it. And that's what I wonder, how and when that's going to happen.
Anybody like to take that quickly?
Yeah, I'll take it pretty quickly, I hope.
Sure.
Am I on? Okay. So I think you hit the right points because, the technological revolution has and will continue to allow us to monitor more and more things more accurately, more precisely, with better granularity, with, the ability to analyze on a real-time basis. The difficulty is, of course, what the last thing you mentioned, which is clinical validation. What does it mean? So what and who cares, right? Now, I'll give you an example quickly. If I'm wearing a Fitbit, which is a consumer device, right? It's not a medical grade device. And I really do believe, which it kind of does okay, it'll tell me how many steps I'm taking. I have to be a believer that means something else, right? That it means it's related to my caloric expenditure, how much weight I'm going to lose, how long I'm going to live, and what the quality of my life is going to be. But I would say that, I used to drive around with an orthopedic resident when I was a resident myself, and he used to love watching people run down the streets because he would look at him and he goes, that's right over there, knee replacement in 15 years, 30 years from now, hip replacement over there, I can't wait. And so here's the question. Depending on what the real clinical endpoint is, whether it's longevity or quality of life, whatever measures you want to use, whatever you want to peg it to, or if it's replacement of joints, well, it may not be great to be taking 10,000 steps a day for the next 20 years if that's your endpoint. So this clinical validation piece is critically important. Just because we can measure things and do it well and transmit it well and maybe even analyze it well doesn't mean that we should. We have to pick the right things.
Thank you. And on this cautionary note, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking this terrific panel. Thank you very much.